Imagine standing on the shore of a vast reservoir on a windless autumn day. The water is dark, almost black, so still it looks like polished obsidian. Below the surface, 40 feet down, 60 feet down, sometimes 90 feet down, lie the remains of an entire world. Stone walls that once marked the boundaries between neighboring farms, cellar holes where families gathered for Sunday dinners, the foundations of churches where children were baptized and couples married, roads that connected villages, now leading nowhere but into the cold Massachusetts water. There are old wells down there, doorsteps, the remnants of a mill where a river once turned a wheel. This is the Quabbin Reservoir, and it is one of the largest man-made graveyards in American history. Not a graveyard of bodies, though we'll get to that, but a graveyard of place, of community, of home. If you could drain the Quabbin today, you would see the ghostly outlines of 4 entire towns: Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott. Towns that were not abandoned, not evacuated due to disaster, but deliberately, methodically erased. Homes burned, trees felled, graves dug up, to create what is now the primary water supply for Boston and dozens of surrounding communities. 2,500 people were forced to leave. 7,000 bodies were exhumed from their resting places. An entire valley, 39 square miles, was sacrificed on the altar of progress. This is the story of the Quabbin, and it is not a story of engineering triumph. It is a tragedy. To understand why this happened, you have to understand Boston in the early 20th century. By the 1920s, Boston was a beast, a hungry, growing, thirsty beast. The city had exploded in population. Immigration waves from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe had packed the tenements. Industry hummed day and night. Factories, homes, hospitals all demanded water, clean water, endless water. And Boston was running out. The city had already built reservoir after reservoir. They dammed the Sudbury River. They built the Wachusett Reservoir, flooding the town of West Boylston in 1908. But it wasn't enough. Projections showed that by the 1940s, Boston's water system would fail. Taps would run dry. Industry would shut down. Disease would spread. Something had to be done, something big. The engineers at the Metropolitan District Water Supply Commission looked at maps of Massachusetts. They needed a valley, a big one with a natural basin that could hold billions of gallons, one with rivers to feed it, and, crucially, one that was empty, or at least empty of people who mattered. They found it in the Swift River Valley, about 65 miles west of Boston, in a part of Massachusetts that might as well have been a different world. The Swift River Valley was rural, agricultural, quiet. 4 small towns sat in the valley: Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott. Together, they held about 2,500 people. Farmers, mostly, shopkeepers, millers, people whose families had lived there for generations, whose ancestors were buried in the hillside cemeteries, whose lives were woven into the fabric of that place. To Boston, these towns were negligible, expendable. The population of one city block versus the needs of a million. In 1922, the Massachusetts legislature began discussing the plan. In 1927, they passed the Swift River Act. The valley was condemned. The 4 towns were sentenced to death. The people who lived there had no vote, no appeal, no power. The state would pay for their homes, their land, fair market value, they said, but the price was non-negotiable. The timeline was non-negotiable. The outcome was non-negotiable. Imagine receiving a letter in the mail, an official letter on state letterhead, informing you that your home, the home your grandfather built, where your children were born, where every room holds a memory, will be destroyed. You have a few years to leave. You will be compensated. The amount is final. That is what happened to every resident of the Swift River Valley. The notices began arriving in the late 1920s. At first, there was resistance. Town meetings were held, petitions were signed, letters were written to Boston newspapers, pleading the case for these small communities. But the decision had already been made. The act had passed. The engineers were already surveying the land. One woman, interviewed years later, described the feeling this way. It was like being told you had a terminal illness, but you were still expected to go about your daily life while waiting to die. By the mid-1930s, the exodus had begun. Families sold their farms for a fraction of what they were worth emotionally, even if the state's appraisers called it fair. They packed up their lives, furniture, photographs, heirlooms, and moved to neighboring towns. Athol, Ware, Belchertown, places that weren't home, places where they were outsiders. Some families had lived in the valley since the 1700s, generations of roots severed, but perhaps the most haunting part of this process was not the living leaving. It was the dead. There were 34 cemeteries in the Swift River Valley. Some were small family plots tucked into the woods. Others were proper town cemeteries with neat rows of headstones dating back to the Revolutionary War. All told, these cemeteries held the remains of more than 7,000 people. The state decided that all of them had to be moved. Starting in 1934, crews began the grim work of exhumation. Gravediggers worked through the summer heat and into the fall, unearthing coffins, many of them rotted, collapsed, reduced to fragments. They cataloged each body, matched it to records, and prepared it for reburial in a new location. Quabbin Park Cemetery, a centralized burial ground on a hill overlooking the future reservoir. Families were notified. Some came to witness the reburial. Others couldn't bear it. Imagine that. Imagine being forced to leave your home and then being told that your ancestors, your grandmother, your infant sibling who died a century ago, your great-great-grandfather who fought in the Revolution, would also be uprooted, dug up, moved. The coffins were often in terrible condition. Bones were sometimes loose in the soil. Headstones were cracked or missing. Workers did their best to keep everything organized, but mistakes were made. Some graves were never found. Some remains were lost, mixed up, or reburied without proper identification. For the families, this wasn't just relocation, it was desecration, a final indignity. One resident later said, "It wasn't enough to take our homes, they had to take our dead too. They took everything." In 1938, the four towns held their final official meetings. These were not ordinary town meetings, they were funerals. In Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott, residents gathered one last time in their town halls. They voted to dissolve their own municipal governments, to officially cease to exist. The motions passed. The minutes were recorded. The books were closed. Prescott's last town meeting was held on April 28, 1938. The final motion was to appropriate $358 for outstanding bills. Then it was over. Prescott, Massachusetts, incorporated in 1822, was no more. The town halls themselves would soon be demolished. The post offices closed. The schools, already empty, were boarded up. By 1939, the valley was almost empty. A few holdouts remained, elderly residents who refused to leave until forced, families delaying the inevitable. But the state was patient. The deadline approached. One by one, they left. Once the people were gone, the real work began. The valley had to be prepared. You can't just flood a landscape full of buildings and trees and expect clean drinking water. Everything had to be removed. Everything had to be destroyed. Starting in 1938, demolition crews moved through the valley like a slow-moving fire. Homes were stripped of anything salvageable. Windows, doors, fixtures, and then burned. One by one, houses that had stood for 100 years or more went up in flames. Barns, sheds, churches, schools, all of it reduced to ash and charred timbers, which were then buried or hauled away. Trees were felled, tens of thousands of trees. The valley had been lush with maples, oaks, and pines. All of it had to come down. The logs were sold for timber, the stumps were pulled, the land was scraped nearly bare. Roads were torn up, bridges demolished, stone walls knocked down, wells were filled in. Anything that could rot, rust, or contaminate the water was removed. By 1939, the Swift River Valley looked like the surface of the moon. A vast, empty, scarred landscape. The only things left standing were a few stone foundations and the skeletal remains of a world that had been. Then came the dam. The Windsor Dam and the Goodnaught Dike were massive undertakings, among the largest earth-filled dams ever constructed. Built between 1936 and 1939, they sealed off the valley. The Swift River, which had flowed freely for millennia, was stopped, and then the water came. It took 7 years for the Quabbin Reservoir to fill. The water rose slowly. First it covered the riverbeds, then the low-lying fields, then the roads, then the foundations of homes, then the stone walls, then the hillsides. By 1946, the reservoir was full, 45 miles of shoreline, a surface area of nearly 40 square miles, holding 412 billion gallons of water. Boston had its water, the beast was satisfied. But down below, in the cold and dark, 4 towns slept. Today, the Quabbin is beautiful, hauntingly so. It's one of the largest wilderness areas in Massachusetts. Bald eagles nest in the trees. The water is pristine, some of the cleanest drinking water in the country. Hikers walk trails along the shore. Fishermen cast lines into the depths. But it is not a natural place. It is a monument to the ultimate power of the state over the individual, the power to say, your home, your history, your dead, none of it matters more than the collective need. The people of Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott didn't have a choice. They didn't vote on the Swift River Act. They didn't consent to the flooding. The state decided, the state acted, the state erased. This is eminent domain at its most absolute. Now, chances are the government isn't going to flood your town. The age of building massive reservoirs by condemning entire valleys is mostly over, but the power that created the Quabbin hasn't gone anywhere. It's just changed form. Today, that power lives in zoning laws, in conservation restrictions, in wetland regulations and historic district ordinances, in local bylaws that dictate what you can build, where you can build it, and what you can do with your own land. These laws exist for good reasons, many of them, but they also represent a fundamental truth that the Quabbin makes impossible to ignore. Your land is never entirely yours. The state always has the final say. If you're thinking about buying land in New England, especially rural land, land with water access, or land near conservation areas, you need to understand the invisible web of restrictions that might already be woven over it. Wetlands you didn't know existed, setback requirements, zoning overlays, easements granted decades ago. You likely won't face a reservoir flooding your home, but you might face a conservation restriction that makes your land useless. The last thing you want is to buy your dream property and discover you can't build on it. The Quabbin is still there, still full, still feeding water to Boston and 45 other communities, still beautiful, still silent. And far below, where the light doesn't reach, the stones of 4 lost towns remain, waiting.